Good afternoon from Washington, D.C. My name's Tom Banchoff. I serve as Vice President for Global Engagement here at Georgetown, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to today's discussion of China's Belt and Road Initiative as it plays out in Africa. I think you'll agree, a critically important but often misunderstood topic. At the outset, I'd like to recognize the sponsors of this event across our Georgetown community, including the Africa-China Initiative, the African Studies Program, and the Asian Studies Program in the Walsh School of Foreign Service, as well as our university-wide initiative for U.S.-China dialogue on global issues. Now, in a moment, I'll be turning things over to Laura Smith, Director of the African Studies Program, who will be moderating today's panel. But first, I want to especially acknowledge Yoon Jung Park and her critical, innovative work leading the Africa-China Initiative. As many of you know, today's conversation is one in a series of excellent events over this past year, bearing on different dimensions of Chinese engagement in Africa. A series which gets us beyond the familiar and false view that China, the United States, and other global actors are driving developments on the continent. The initiative and its programs are deepening our understanding of the complexity of Chinese engagement in Africa and the central role, the leading role played by African government, business, and civil society actors in responding to and shaping that engagement. We'll see this critical perspective reflected today in the conversation that will take us beyond the familiar Belt and Road narrative towards a better understanding of how it is playing out on the ground, highlighting the role of African actors in shaping outcomes. If you'll allow me just a final word about Georgetown's overall engagement with China before I hand it off to Laura. As a Jesuit university in Washington, D.C., committed to intercultural dialogue for the common good, Georgetown will continue to engage with China and around China-related issues in spite of the heightened geopolitical tensions we're all aware of over these past several years. In no way denying our deep differences on issues of democracy and human rights, we're persuaded that we need to explore areas of overlapping interest and potential cooperation around global issues such as climate change and public health, but also across key world regions, including Africa. That's a conviction that underpins our university-level initiative for U.S.-China dialogue on global issues, which is delighted to be collaborating with the Africa-China Initiative on today's event and other activities. So with that, thank you all again for joining us. And now let me turn things over to you, Laura, to frame our topic and introduce our panelists.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Tom, for that introduction. And thank you to you and your office for engaging on this and other events that we've had. I also want to add my note of thanks to all those who've helped with this and other Africa-China Initiative events this year. As you mentioned, the Africa-China Initiative brings together a number of programs, centers, and units at Georgetown who share research and policy interests in the ways that the diverse and dynamic countries of Africa are engaging with their counterparts in China. We have sought to continue a shift in focus towards Africa by centering the experiences of particular African countries, as well as particular sectors, industries, and outcomes in the research and policy focus. This speaker series that today's talk is a part of seeks to illuminate the multiple contexts and forms in which these partnerships and possibilities can and do occur. And today we focus on a topic that rightly garners a lot of attention in various countries in Africa because the infrastructure needs and demands are so significant, and also because Chinese companies have stepped in to meet so many of these needs. How these projects have been negotiated and managed within particular contexts in Africa varies, and how citizens view them evidences variation as well, a topic that's worth delving into. So I want to thank the Henry Luce Foundation for their financial commitment and support. This is a joint initiative with our colleagues, as was mentioned, in the Asian Studies Program, and I want to thank them and their director, Dr. Yuki Tajima, at the School of Foreign Service, for this talk, as well as others that are also jointly sponsored with the U.S.-China Dialogue on Global Issues, as was mentioned. We're really grateful the partners that we have that have continued to support us at the university. I also want to thank Marta Manzano, who's behind the scenes making this all happen, as well as Yifan Chen, our student assistant. And finally, I also want to add my thanks to Dr. Yoon Jung Park, who's the coordinator of the initiative, who works tirelessly to convene and coordinate such a rich and diverse panel of scholars each month, including this month. It quite literally could not happen without Dr. Park. So I'd like to introduce our panel of speakers. I'll introduce them all at the outset, and then they will speak in the order that I have introduced them to you, but I want to say a little bit about their background before they give their presentations. We're really delighted to welcome you and thank you to our speakers for your time today in coming to share your expertise with us. Dr. Hong Zhang is a postdoctoral fellow at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Harvard Kennedy School. Dr. Hong received her PhD in public policy from George Mason in 2021. She has a master's in sociology from the London School of Economics and a bachelor's degree in economics from Renmin University in China. Dr. Hong's current research looks at the internationalization of Chinese infrastructure construction industry. She was also a postdoctoral fellow at the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies in 2021-2022. She'll be talking on the topic of from contractor to investor, evolving roles of Chinese companies in African infrastructure development. Our second speaker is Dr. Oscar Otele, who's a political scientist and governance consultant with over 15 years of experience. Dr. Otele is currently based at the University of Nairobi, where he doubles as a senior lecturer at the Department of Political Science and Public Administration, and is an Afrobarometer national investigator at the Institute for Development Studies. He's also an adjunct faculty member in the National Defense University, Kenya, and Radboud University in the Netherlands. His paper is titled A Governance Discourse on China's Development Finance in the East Africa Region. And then finally, we'll hear from Jude Moore, who is a senior policy fellow at the Center for Global Development. He previously served as Liberia's Minister of Public Works with oversight over the construction and maintenance of public infrastructure. Prior to that, Mr. Moore served as the Deputy Chief of Staff to President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf and head of the President's Delivery Unit. As head of this unit, he monitored progress and drove delivery of programs worth over $1 billion in road, power, port infrastructure, and social programs after Liberia's civil war. In addition to this, Mr. Moore is a lecturer at the University of Chicago's Harris School for Public Policy. He has a bachelor's degree in political science from BRI College and a master's degree from our own School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown. Mr. Moore will speak from an African government perspective on Africa-China infrastructure engagement. So as I mentioned, the speakers will speak in this order. They'll speak for about 20 minutes. We know that many in our audience today, we're so delighted that you're with us as well. We thank you for your time. You will have questions. You're welcome to save those questions to the end. We'll be happy to engage them, or if you have them as we go along, please put those questions into the question and answer box here in the webinar format, and we'll gather those together and we'll have a discussion as we go. So I turn it over to you, Dr. Hong, to get us started. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Smith. I'll share my screen now. I guess my task today in today's panel is to address the role of the Chinese contractors in China-Africa infrastructure engagements. And I'll talk about my ongoing research about the evolution of the way the Chinese state capital engages in global infrastructure development. And this is still research in progress, so my findings are still preliminary, but I hope it will provide a useful way for us to look at China-Africa infrastructure engagements. So first, let me provide an overview of my presentation today. Though I wouldn't have time to elaborate, I want to state upfront that my research seeks to contribute to the understanding of China's global infrastructure engagements from an industry-centered rather than state-centered perspective, because oftentimes research on this topic is. And taking this industry-centered view is not to deny that the state has a role to play in such engagements, and there's also political dynamics at play. And it is just to provide a more micro-level foundation for us to make sense of the dynamics. And essentially, my argument is that the Chinese infrastructure industry's need for continued internationalization and the way the state will support it determined the outlook of China's global infrastructure engagements. So with that, my goal today is to introduce an emerging trend in the industry as a so-called Integrated Investment Construction Operation, or IICO, or in Chinese, 投建营一体化, this model seems to become the industry strategy for its continued internationalization. I will explain the context for such transition, as well as discussing a case study of Lekki Port in Nigeria, drawing from my fieldwork in the country in June this year. And based on that, I hope to discuss the implications for future China-Africa infrastructure engagements. So to place Africa in the global picture of Chinese infrastructure industry's internationalization, we can look at this graph, which shows the market share of Chinese companies in various markets among the world's top 250 international contractors. Obviously, Chinese companies have become very dominant in Africa, with around 60% of market share in recent years, as you can see on this red line. But we can see that the dynamics in Africa is a little different from the rest of the world, or from Chinese companies' performance in the rest of the world. Whereas the Chinese market share rose most quickly in Africa in the from the 2000s to early 2010s, it has slowed down since mid 2010s. But the rest of the world, especially Asia, as shown in this blue line, China's market share grew more rapidly in this latter period. And in this graph, we can have a closer look at Africa as the market of China's export market of China's construction industry. The Chinese authorities regularly collect statistics from the companies in terms of the new contracts they signed, which are shown in the orange bars, and the actual completed contracts shown in the blue bars. And so not all the contracts signed would be eventually realized due to various reasons. Therefore, there's always a gap between the two. But as you can see, both measures indicate a very rapid increase in the first 15 years of the 21st century, but both have come to a decline since around 2015 or 2016. Such market expansion in Africa has been related to the availability of a Chinese funding, as the gray bars in the graph also show the amount of loans provided by Chinese banks to Africa, which has been in decline as well, actually even earlier, since around 2013, except 2016, which was an exceptional year. There was a spike, but that's for some different reasons. I won't go into details. So if we compare this to China's contracting activities globally, as you can see shown in the red bars and blue bars, they're still growing in the global scale. On the global scale, the Chinese contracting activities are still growing, but in Africa, we already see this decline. So it seems Africa is in a relative decline as an overseas market for Chinese construction industry. And there may be many reasons behind this. The most obvious ones may be Africa's deteriorating economic conditions that made it less able to pay for infrastructure projects, or the Belt and Road Initiative launched in 2013 actually helped shift the focus of the Chinese industry to Asia. But another potential reason that I would like to discuss is the shift in the industry's internationalization strategy from the low value added contracting to high value added investment and operation, which may be contributing to such change. So Africa was actually particularly important for the Chinese industry in the 2000s until early 2010s, when the industry was at such a position that it mainly competed on a low cost based advantage. And very importantly, the availability of a Chinese financing, essentially export credits, also helped fuel the expansion of the Chinese industry in Africa. But starting from 2010s, this industry has started to discuss the need to move up the value chain. Specifically, they have been talking about the model of so-called integrated investment construction operation, or IICO. And in this context, Africa is not the market that can best accommodate this model or this transition. And let me elaborate a little bit on this so-called IICO. This graph shows a so-called smiling curve, which the industry people often use to describe their situation. The y-axis is the value added, and the x-axis is the project life cycle. of an infrastructure project. And as we can see, the construction activity that the Chinese companies used to focus on is in the middle of the project life cycle, but also is the lowest value added. So that's why the companies, the higher value added activities are actually located in the early stage of the project life cycle and later projects in terms of the investment and project development and in the operation and maintenance. And also the design engineering is also more higher value added and more profitable than construction. And that's why the Chinese companies want to move beyond their traditional role in this area to the entire project cycle, to capture the entire project cycle. And so not only is there a lot of discussion within the industry, the idea of IICO has already received policy endorsements. And the notion of IICO first appeared in policy discussions in around 2015, because already then we already saw reports about China's major industry associations organizing alliance of leading companies to explore this IICO model. And later we also saw a series of policy documents or high-level statements mentioning IICO, including a joint guideline by Chinese Ministry of Commerce and the State-Owned Assets Supervision and Administration Commission, SASAC, in 2016, which called for the Chinese central state-owned companies to pursue IICO. And IICO was also mentioned in President Xi Jinping's speech during the 2015 FOCAC summit. Again, in 2019, a guideline jointly issued by China's 19 ministries to guide the so-called high-quality development in the contracting industry. IICO was also included as one of the ways to pursue high-quality investment. And the emergence of IICO as a prospective model for the industry's continued internationalization can be attributed to a number of reasons. The most important, most immediate reason, I think, is the problems with the past EPC plus F, or the engineering, procurement, construction plus finance model that has been the dominant model in the Chinese infrastructure industry's engagement in Africa and elsewhere. And because the Chinese companies are driven by the incentives to win more construction contracts, they help host country political elites, or in a way collude with them, to secure financing from China for such infrastructure projects whose long-term economic viability is questionable. And in turn, the Chinese banks also didn't have enough capacity to identify risks in these projects, given that they were also quite new in the game. And in addition, the host country may also lack the capacity to operate or maintain the infrastructure projects after the construction was completed by the Chinese companies, which contributed to the poorer performance of these projects than their forecast in their feasibility studies. And so I think the best case to illustrate this is actually the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, which often is used as the example of debt trap, but actually I think it illustrates the dynamics in the moral hazard of this EPC plus F model. And another reason, so the Chinese financial institutions and policymakers have realized these problems and have been responding to these problems by pushing the companies to also get involved in the operation of the projects and even provide equity investment. And the idea is that by having a skin in the game, the companies will be more responsible in their pursuit of infrastructure projects. And secondly, from the point of view of the companies, since there were so many Chinese companies trying to expand overseas, especially driven by the BRI, there was over competition among them. And for the leading firms, moving to the higher value added position is a way for them to survive such over competition, because they cannot compete with the smaller firms in terms of cost. And thirdly, it also echoes the rise of public-private partnerships globally, because host countries are increasingly seeking to engage private capital in infrastructure development. And this is also especially true in China itself, as many of the same infrastructure companies who continue to earn their majority income from the domestic market have moved to such roles as investor and operator, of infrastructure projects, and not just as construction contractors. So this experience within China provides some precedent for their overseas activities as well. So how does this transition toward IICO progress? There's no official statistics. And in fact, even what qualifies as an IICO project is still very murky. But one data point I could find was from Sinosure, the China's official export credit agency, insurance agency, which reported that by first half of 2021, it had insured 221 overseas IICO projects with a total investment of $56.3 billion. And this is, of course, not the full picture because not all the overseas investment projects will require Sinosure coverage, but I think it's a good estimate. But if we compare it to the total overseas contracting revenues between 2015, which was the year when IICO began to be promoted, and 2021, this is not a significant share. And as I said, what qualifies as an IICO project is still not clear. And I see that in a lot of discussions, many investments in Southeast Asia's power sectors were included. And now let's turn to Africa. There are relatively few projects that have been identified by the Chinese companies themselves as IICO. So here is a list. It's not an exhaustive list, but it contains some of the cases that are most frequently mentioned and most high-profile projects that are considered IICO in Africa. And we don't have time to go into all the details, but suffice to say that many of these projects that have been branded as IICO, in fact, involve Chinese equity investment as an afterthought. Like the first 4 projects, what happens usually was that the Chinese companies got involved in these projects in the traditional way, in the traditional EPC plus F model. And the host government also borrowed from China. So the sovereign loans were still involved in these projects. And later on, for various reasons, often because the host government couldn't afford the down payment for their loans, to match the loans, and then the Chinese contractors stepped in and provided equity investment. And only the latter 3 cases, we see that the Chinese companies provided equity investment early on, and there was no sovereign loan involved. In other words, there are IICO projects. These are IICO projects that are more commercial in their nature, rather than compared to all these other cases that are still conducted through an intergovernmental framework. And with that overview, I will now turn to this specific case, the Lekki Port in Nigeria. And this video shows the port site from some distance, which was taken during my field work in June this year. And Lekki Port is a very significant project, as it is Nigeria's first deep sea port and one of the largest in West Africa. It is expected to help with Nigeria's maritime economy because the country's 2 existing ports are at overcapacity. And this is also the first African port project in which the Chinese company holds a majority share. It is also Nigeria's first PPP port project. And so let me briefly introduce the involvement of the Chinese company, the China Harbor Engineering Company, CHEC, in this project. And many of you probably already know that CHEC is a very prominent infrastructure construction company, mainly active in the port construction sector, but also in many other infrastructure sectors as well. It has built many port projects in Africa and elsewhere in the world. Also famously involved in the Hambantota port project in Sri Lanka. And CHEC actually didn't initiate this project. In fact, it was done by a Singaporean company called Toleram, which has been very active and prominent in Nigeria for decades. But it's mainly in the consumer sector because it actually produces and manufactures and markets an instant noodle, which was a household food item in Nigeria. But Toleram managed to reach a concessional agreement with the Nigerian government in 2021 to develop this port. And CHEC got involved as the EPC contractor in 2022. However, Tolaram failed to secure financing for this project, which is why it started to talk to other interested investors and seek additional investment. So it was in this context that CHEC proposed to provide equity investment, and through negotiations, it acquired 70% of the share in the joint venture with Tolaram, which was finally translated into a 52.5% of stake in the Lekki Port LFTZ Enterprise Limited, which is a concessionaire of the Lekki Port project. And in addition, for the operation of the port, CHEC formed a joint venture with a French shipping giant, CMA, in which joint venture the CHEC takes a 20% stake. What we can see from this case is that even for a leading Chinese infrastructure company with very dominant market share in Africa's infrastructure construction, for it to engage in IICO is not easy at all. CHEC's success in making the Lekki Port an IICO project has critically depended on other international actors. First, the most important part, the most difficult part of any greenfield infrastructure development in this case was done by Tolaram, because Tolaram negotiated with the Nigerian government for the concession terms, and CHEC simply inherited the concession agreement. And so CHEC's ability to carry out this critical process remains untested. And secondly, for the port to be successful, for the port to be a successful investment, the operation is the key, because that's where the revenue is going to be, they are going to collect the revenue from. So in this regard, CHEC has to rely on CMA, the French shipping company that already enjoys a significant market share in Nigeria, to provide the expertise in the operation. And in fact, my interviewee also told me that CMA's guarantee of the port's traffic was the reason, or was the very important reason why the CHEC decided to invest in the project. Otherwise, the company leaders couldn't trust in the forecast about the project's future prospect, and they wouldn't be be so determined, make the decision to invest in the project. And moreover, the port's successful operation also critically depends on the matching infrastructure surrounding the port area, and that will require the company to work very closely with the Nigerian government to sort out. But it's not clear if CHEC can manage that. So what I would like you to take away from this case is that the Chinese infrastructure companies face a very steep learning curve for them to shift this new model of IICO. And it is especially difficult in high-risk markets like Africa. In Asia, or in Eastern or Southern Europe, or even in Latin America, where the market institutions are relatively more developed, we are actually seeing more activities, more investments, projects, more projects that can be considered IICO in those regions. And so that's why Africa's relative importance, as we see in the previous graph that I showed in China's global infrastructure landscape, has relatively declined. And as even as Chinese companies pursue IICO projects in Africa, they still need to rely a lot on other international partners, especially European companies that continue to occupy very important positions in the African market. So I will conclude with this final slide. I think, like I said, should the IICO become a mainstream for the Chinese infrastructure industry internationalization strategy, Africa's relative importance in the global picture for the Chinese industry may decline. And with that said, Africa's unmet demand for infrastructure still will be very important for the Chinese companies. They are still waiting for the turnaround in Africa's economic conditions so that they could come back. And of course, there's still room for their traditional contracting. And even as Chinese companies move to this role as investors rather than contractors, and we could probably expect that there might be some suspicion that because they have equity investment, they have the ownership in these key infrastructure projects in Africa, there would be some new dynamics in the politics, there might be suspicion that all these state-owned companies might have some strategic agenda in Africa. But as we can see in the case of Lekki Port, the Chinese companies are actually not in a position of leverage. They still rely a lot on the input of other international actors. So with that, I'll conclude my presentation, and I will look forward to our discussion later on.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hong, for that presentation. And we will turn it over to Dr. Otele. I think, excellent. So Dr. Otele, it's you next. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to share some thoughts on a governance discourse on China's development finance in East Africa region. And I want to put this in the context of my own research interest that is increasingly focusing on China infrastructure development in Africa, especially through a comparative lens. And in my presentation this time, I'm focusing on Kenya and Uganda. Is it able to move? Okay. Yeah, so by way of introduction, as you are all familiar, there's heightened scholarship around BRI projects and their implication in Africa. And this subject, of course, has been approached through several perspectives, I call them. Their interest on geopolitics and more about expected benefits among different stakeholders. And of course, as BRI is being implemented in various parts of Africa, there is need to make appreciation in terms of how African countries are responding to BRI, and the question of governance always pops up. And of course, this has been there since China renewed its engagement on the African continent. But of course, at every time, there's always the question of governance. But from where I sit, there are certain aspects that we usually lose in this, certain aspects that are lost in this conversation. I situate my discussion, I anchor my presentation on a number of thoughts that we always need to take into consideration when we bring this governance context into the limelight. We shouldn't lose the fact that colonial legacies are still present in contemporary African governance practice. And when you look at the African continent, based on those legacies, the Anglophones and the Anglophones, the Francophones, you realize even in terms of the current institutions, some African states, especially the Anglophones, have relatively established governance institutions compared to their counterparts in Francophone. And the reality of these institutions have implication on implementation of these BRI projects in Africa. Now, if you pick, for example, East Africa region, and we compare the situation in Kenya and Uganda, these are countries that have near similar colonial heritage. One, of course, will expect sort of to have a resemblance in their response to governance practice. So then my interest is to expose the dynamics of implementation of selected BRI projects in the infrastructure sector, to see how those dynamics will have implication on our understanding of these projects. I also make appreciation to how the concept of governance is seen from a Chinese perspective, where these projects are emanating, are largely seen to emanate from. Two broad perspectives that we discern from the literature. And there is, on one hand, the liberal view that is rooted in the Western thinking about governance practice, paying more attention on the rule of law, transparency, accountability, and public participation. On the other hand, we have a leftist view that views good governance in the sense of the outcome rather than the process. And therefore, we see more attention being paid on bureaucratic efficiency and corruption effort. Now, then the question that we proceed logically, we want to see how the Chinese good governance manifestation of practices are exported in the implementation of this project, particularly within these two regions. We do recognize that since President Xi Jinping's ascendancy to power in 2000, there has been lots of emphasis on good governance. Virtually in almost all sectors, and therefore, when we see that espoused in policy documents, we then, as observers of China in Africa, we are interested to understand how such is implemented on the ground. If you look at the financial institutions, look at the Exim Bank, for example, the 2015 guideline, 2016 guidelines, BRI 2015 action plan, BRI 2017 vision for maritime cooperation. There is more and others. There is more emphasis just sustaining the conversation from the national level to the extent that they also visualize the implementation of this governance practice. Now, how then this practice interact with the local context from a comparative perspective? Much has been said about local context. In specific context, for example, looking at the case study of Nigeria, others have looked at Zambia, Kenya have written lots of paper on Kenya. My attention is to try and zoom into comparative lens and see how this is interacting. Obviously, we do recognize that those two countries, Kenya and Uganda, I would say have relatively robust legal and regulatory frameworks to respond to emerging socioeconomic and environmental issues, pretty much similar to what is also visualized in the Chinese policymakers as they go about implementing these projects. So how are these dynamics taking shape if you look at comparative cases in those two countries? Now, I picked two infrastructure projects, Kenya Standard Gauge Railway and Uganda Kampala-Entebbe Express Way. The one is a railway project. This one is a road project. And of course, in the interest of time, lots of papers, as you have seen, as you can see in my projection there, a number of scholars have written a lot on this subject. I will not get into the description of how much loan, how long the project is running. I'll save that for another day. And you allow me to zoom into now the comparative perspectives along the themes that I have identified there, looking at the inceptions and the cost dynamics, procurement and public debt and issues to do with environmental conservation. Of course, just a disclaimer, looking into the comparative dimension, given that the projects are in different sectors, the outcome could be different. But the reason why I'm comparing, just to give us an impression of how dynamics of implementing BRI projects may take shape, as this project actually is cutting across a number of regions and, of course, a number of nation states. Now, when you look at on the subject of inception and costs, for example, you realize that in both projects, there was no real public participation. And from there, given that citizens in both countries were not able to scrutinize the content and question the expected benefits of the project, therefore, these really undermined a transparency. And of course, that then exposed the project to lots of discourse regarding the actual costs in both cases, to the extent that critical opposition leaders came up strongly to even question and ask the executive to table the actual amounts of the actual amount that were appropriated, and therefore the cost of the projects, the actual cost of the project, still remain mysterious, even though we know that certain amount have already been provided. Now, just like other infrastructure projects, the political incentives is always at the core of this project, because infrastructure projects offer African leaders, a visibility, political capital. In the case of Standard Gauge Railway, that was evident as former President Uhuru Kenyatta actually pushed the implementation of the project and ensure that any barrier that would come up in front of the implementation of this project was, was done away with, and that when compared to the situation in Kampala, it was quite different because of the low incentives. So President Museveni didn't have to worry much about the election, and therefore a small project, which is close to 50 kilometers, dragged on for more than 5 years or about. If you look at the issues to do with procurement and public debate, in both cases, again, the procurement processes conflicted the national laws, that is public procurement and disposal acts, and therefore there was no competitive bidding, and therefore again we didn't know the actual amounts of amount that was spent, even though, as I have said, there are certain numbers that were shared. And one even, despite the numbers that have been shared in the media and the ones that we are using to make our publication, the question of whether there was value for the value for the money remains a concern, because that was not subjected to competitive bidding. Of course, in both cases, acquisition of these loans have pushed the country's debt to China to new heights. And as you can see, the figures in both Kenya and Uganda have gone up, and therefore that also provided folder to the question of debt sustainability and the so-called debt trap narrative. On matters environmental conservation and acquisition, on matters environmental conservation, land acquisition and compensation, in the case of SGR, initially the Chinese embassy was quite keen to see to it that the local environmental issues and social regulation were adhered to, and this was reflected in the manner in which they will do rounds of regular visitation meetings, and of course, in collaboration with other institutions, conducted a training to create awareness in the event that anything was violated. In the case of expressway in Uganda, of course, that was bedeviled with claims of corruption between China Communication construction companies and the Ugandan authority regarding environmental issues. And in both cases, again, we see a compulsory land acquisition and compensation of local community was the most controversial issues. Of course, this, as you may be aware, land issues in Africa is quite emotive, and therefore, whenever there is a project that requires resettlement of the people, there's always a push back from the local communities, and of course that then sometimes feeds into the corrupt networks that takes advantage of the project to buy land and then later on sell to the same government. This was evident in both cases. Now, when we look at those issues, for us as the observers of the implementation of these projects, now we have always asked then, what is the weakest link in the implementation of these projects? Of course, if you remember from where I began, colonial legacies and how that had implication on African governance practice. If indeed these practices are deeply entrenched deeply entrenched in our political system. Are they the weak link? Now they're finding space to interact with, of course, within the competitive space where Chinese companies also want to outdo their competitors. If that is an opportunity that has created some kind of convergency, and in a sense, giving ground for sustenance of this, bad governance practice. So this is the question that I'm trying to pose. So, in light of that, that controversial standpoint, what needs to be done as a way forward? We're seeing a multiplicity of stakeholders coming together, uniting to implement these projects. Chinese authorities, African authorities, Chinese actors, African actors. So I prefer some recommendations that may, be put in place to see to it that this governance practice are visualized as initially conceived. So I say that Chinese authorities need to put in place more efficient monitoring mechanism that push for application of the same standards abroad when recipient governance standards are lacking or weak. Now, the point here that whether the context is different, there's need to have standard practice emanating from Chinese authority, because we also underscore from where we sit, seeing China as a flex hegemony, just to borrow Kamodi and Taylor's word, the ability to flex, the ability to adjust to different local contexts. So the way China responds to local context in Kenya is different from the way it responds to Uganda. So what needs to be done so that then we are not seeing this variation? We can also ask, can African Union, the continental body, play a critical role in terms of formulating and coming up with standardized shared universal governance that now can be seen as an oversight body to see to it that these countries are supposed to implement similar rather universal governance standard as opposed to a recipient countries practice. Then we also need to bring in other actors, especially non-state actors. I have civil society in mind, so that then they are also brought into the picture. They get to know what's happening right from the inception in order to address some of the potential disruption that may delay the completion of the project. So those are my thoughts, and I'll be looking forward for participants to respond to the presentation. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Otele, for all that rich examples from the East Africa cases. We look forward to that discussion, and we'll now turn it over to Mr. Jude Moore for our third and final presentation, please.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you, Yoon, and it's a pleasure to be back here. I thought for my presentation today, I should just talk about the context in which this relationship occurs. What is it African governments are responding to when they form these partnerships with China, and why the BRI, or before that, Chinese infrastructure financing has been so important to the continent, where we are today, and what it looks like going forward. I think the points that Dr. Hong made about IICO, about how much of that is driven by Chinese demands, the point that Oscar just made about the quality of governance around those are all very important points. And I'll come to those, my thoughts on those toward the end. But first, I want to start with the infrastructure deficit on the continent. I think it's important for us to understand that this is the departure point. There is not an African country you're going to go to where there isn't some sort of plan, some sort of vision 2030, vision 2025. It's usually a country's poverty development reduction plan. The African Union has a similar plan. It's called Vision 2063, Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. A lot of what we're seeing on the continent today, the AFCFTA, a common flight zone, all of that comes out of that. So this is where African countries are. The primary thing they're looking to do is to end poverty. And Africa is, of all the regions of the world, is significantly affected by both the lack of infrastructure and dysfunction of existing infrastructure. For example, over the last 2 decades, road density and the amount of available roads, or number of kilometers of available roads per, say, 1,000 people, has actually declined on the continent, while it's increased in other parts of the world. Energy access. Some people put the number at 560 plus million, others are 600 million Africans lack access to reliable and cheap electricity. According to the bank, at current rates of energy expansion, in 10 years, and close to 250 million people will still lack access to electricity on the continent. Internet availability, Africa still lags the rest of the world. And it's up to 300 million Africans who do not have access to internet. So the basic infrastructure that is required to be able to build a modern economy is either missing or dysfunctional in most of these countries, right? And because of that, it has significant impact on the quality of African firms and the ability to compete, but the quality of African lives, right? Transport costs really high. In fact, logistics costs in Africa are sometimes 3 to 4 times higher than the average in other parts of the world. According to the African Development Bank, these costs can sometimes add up to 75% to the price of goods on the continent. So not only is it a poor continent, the cost of everything is really high on the continent because of the quality of its infrastructure. Since 80 to 90% of freight movement on the continent occurs on roads, you can begin to see how difficult it is. There's a report from the Exim Bank of India that says that of the 2.8 million kilometers of roads on the continent, only 0.8 of that is paved. I mean, the number I used to use before was 43%, but if we were to go by the numbers from the Indian Exim Bank, that's about 28% of the roads on the continent that are paved. And so one begins to see how difficult it is for African governments, but more importantly, the continent is also the fastest growing. It's the youngest continent, and because the infrastructure has not kept pace with population growth, it's meant that whatever infrastructure currently exists on the continent comes under significant strain. And so because of that, African countries have sought partnerships that will allow them to be able to build out their infrastructure. So that's the first thing, the huge infrastructure gap on the continent. The second thing is because of the continent's low savings rate, and I'm not going to go into that, but part of what drives that low savings rate is the high fertility that we're talking about. If the total fertility rate of the continent is around 4.2, it's really difficult for people who are already poor, having up to 4 kids, to be able to put significant amounts of money aside in savings. More importantly, a significant portion of the continent's economy is in the informal sector, so that money isn't getting saved in banks. And so because of that low savings rate, the continent has to look externally for financing for its infrastructure. The cost of financing for infrastructure is really important, because the more expensive that cost is, the less of that money is available. And so if a player comes along who is able to provide infrastructure at cost that is affordable to African governments, is able to provide infrastructure cheaper than the competitors, you can imagine, even if it were not the Chinese, any player who would have met that would have been embraced in the exact same way as the Africans have. So according to the African Development Bank, the total infrastructure need annually is between 130 to 170 billion. And the only time in recent history where infrastructure spending in Africa has actually crossed the 100 billion mark was in 2018. And I just wanted to do a breakdown. Of that $100.8 billion in 2018 for infrastructure, 37 billion came from African governments themselves in their budgets. That's 37% of the total, followed by China, 25% of that. So a quarter of financing for African infrastructure at the highest ever point the continent itself was able to cross that mark was provided by China. One can begin to see how important the single country is to the financing of infrastructure on the continent. And so China's needs for resources and where the Chinese economy was sort of made Africa an attractive place for Chinese firms. More importantly, as Dr. Hung was saying, at the beginning, when the Chinese first came to Africa, they occupied this really beautiful niche. They were not as, the quality of their work was not equal to the European counterparts, but it was better than the African firms, and they came with financing from Chinese policy banks. It made perfect sense for African countries. Now, today, the quality of the infrastructure provided by the Chinese has actually gone up. So much so that in 2019, 62% of the infrastructure market, construction market in Africa was taken by Chinese firms. So this wasn't simply using Chinese money. They were winning World Bank, African Development Bank, EU contracts to provide infrastructure in Africa. So one is the scale of the infrastructure deficit on the continent and what the continent needs to achieve. The second is the availability of the resources from the Chinese and the value for money procurement, where Chinese contractors are consistently more competitive in a price-sensitive market like Africa to be able to provide our infrastructure. But as I noted before, the high population growth on the continent and the continent's inability to be able to build infrastructure that matches that, and the low performance of African firms because of that. And so we can see how important China has been so I would say that, as African governments, when we're making decisions and where we're going to seek financing for our infrastructure, it is never with an eye toward great power competition and all of that. It is about, first, governments need to provide basic social services, especially public goods for their people, roads, power, water, schools, and social services for their people. And that's what's driving that. And because the continent is poorer than other regions of the world, it makes sense to look for the most competitive financing that we can find. But more importantly, why the Chinese are also attractive is there are instances where Chinese financing is not the cheapest financing available, right? Chinese financing, and especially from Exim Bank, is close to commercial rates. But part of the reason why African governments will continue to take the financing from the Chinese is sometimes Chinese financing is just more agile. From international development agencies, financing of a project from concept to first disbursement will go sometimes from 24 to 36 months. If you're a president with a 4-year term or 5-year term, to go from 24 to 36 months before you can begin to break ground, you can imagine why you would want that capital to be deployed faster than it normally would be. Now, obviously, this relationship has also meant that in places where governance structures are already weak, in places where, and because the Chinese model means that you're not going to a competitive bid, it has opened itself up to significant abuse. abuse from African governments who are negotiating with the Chinese, but also abuse from Chinese firms. In instances, because of a massive competition. I mean, I'll give you an example. One of the projects we awarded in Liberia, we had 23 construction firms pay for the bid documents. Of the 23 firms, 17 of them were Chinese. This intense competition among Chinese firms has also meant that they're willing to do whatever it takes for them to be able to win contracts. China doesn't have its version of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, where Chinese firms engaging in corruption overseas are held accountable to the rules of the domestic jurisdiction. The US has it, the EU has it, China doesn't. And so Chinese firms in this intense competition with essentially other Chinese firms have, in instances, abused those rules. Secondly, the terms under which this lending occurs. China prefers going the bilateral route. China prefers a certain amount of secrecy. I don't know if that has changed, but for a while, the figures on how much China is lending, the scale and scope in terms of those were considered state secrets in China. And so because of that, China is not a member of, say, the OECD or the Paris Club. And so China has no incentives or motivation to publish the rules, publish the terms of its agreements and all of the data. So most of what we know about Chinese data, Chinese lending comes from, say, CARI or A data and other non-Chinese aggregations of the data. But China's insistence on the secrecy of the terms has meant the process itself remains open to abuse. And so to Oscar's point about improving the quality of governance around this is going to be useful, not just for African governments so that we can see what we're paying for, but also for China, because these loans have to be repaid. And so where we are today, the competition among Chinese firms that Dr. Hung spoke about, in some instances, the amount of loans that were extended to countries without actually paying attention to the country's ability to absorb those loans and repay them has meant a significant number of countries are at or close to debt distress because of COVID and because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. China itself has faced headwinds in its economy, and the amount of foreign exchange that the Chinese had before that allowed them to be able to go on, expand the BRI as it were. I don't think that's going to be possible. So here are a couple of things that we're going to see. One is that projects that are already underway are going to continue and finish because it's just more expensive to a project that's 30% or 40% complete. To abandon that project becomes significantly more expensive than finishing the project. So those projects are going to go forward. But I think the Chinese are going to be significantly more stringent in what kinds of projects they finance. The viability of those projects, especially commercial viability, is going to become an issue. So we're seeing that with the Kenyans unable to access more financing for extending the SGR. We saw that with the Nigerians trying to attract financing. And so we think that's going to become a theme with Chinese lending going forward. But the final thing I would say here is, for the last 2 decades, there has been significant criticisms of Chinese lending and lending practices across the world, largely from the United States and in some instances from the EU. It seems like with China now sort of scaling back the amount of money is making available for infrastructure, when the needs continue to be where they are and countries have actually depleted their resources in responding to the health crisis, this seems like the perfect time for the EU and the United States to step up and actually show the Chinese how it ought to be done. But I think for most African governments and people who've observed this space, we understand that that's not going to happen. For there is not yet a like-for-like replacement for the Chinese. And that 25% of African infrastructure financing that the Chinese occupied, there isn't going to be another country that steps up to be able to do that. So obviously for African countries, improving the quality of governance so that they can attract money from the private sector in the infrastructure is going to become really important. We're also going to see a significant uptick in public-private partnerships. in terms of both on the Chinese side, but for African infrastructure. I'd like to stop there so that we can be able to have a conversation and respond to some of the questions that have come. But thanks again for having me here today.
Thank you, Hong, Oscar, and Jude. Okay, I'm taking over from Laura to moderate the Q&A now. Again, really great audience and some of the highest numbers that we've had. We have a few questions that have already popped into the chat, but let me go ahead and read them. And if there's time, I might add a few of my own questions. Thanks so much again. Let's see. I'm just gonna read 2 or 3 of these at a time. And I think the first question was addressed to Hong, and I believe you answered the question in your chat as this came quite early. But Sarah McHugh asked if the decline in the number of loans to Africa from China was due to a default of loans. Ursula Mueller asks, what can you say regarding the issue of regarding the share of Chinese companies securing infrastructure contracts financed by the World Bank? I think Jude addressed this to some extent. And she asked the second question, Dr. Atele, do you have any insights as to the degree to which the social and environmental standards of the World Bank are being implemented by Chinese companies? Finally, Chris Wagner asks, do you see African countries or the AU react to China's IICO initiative? Let me start there, and I'll turn it back to the speakers. Hong, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you for all the questions. The first question about the decline due to the default of loans. Yeah, definitely they are related. Like Jude was saying, the growing number of African countries are going into financial distress, and also in terms of the lending capacity or borrowing capacity of many African countries probably kind of going to reach their ceilings. That has contributed to the slowdown of Chinese lending to Africa, as I show in the graph. Like actually since 2013, there was already a visible decline. And because of a reduction of available finance, that contributed to a lot of contracts that were signed were not able to be finally executed, as the gap between the new contract signed and the actual completed contracts was kind of also growing. That also suggests that because of the difficulty in securing financing from China or elsewhere, a lot of the projects that were in the pipeline were not able to be executed finally. So that I think these are all tied together to why the Chinese company wanted to pursue this new model of IICO, or the Chinese policymakers also kind of encourage the companies to do so, because they want to diversify the financing model from a very state-centered, because a lot of these loans are sovereign loans. They were executed under an intergovernmental framework. So they wanted to encourage the companies to kind of act as more commercially autonomous actors. They pursue projects that they believe would be viable in the long term, and they invest with their own money. And they also kind of still seek financing from Chinese banks, but in a more rigorous way. So that's all related. And the question about the World Bank contracts, yes, I think I did some research before. The Chinese companies since the past maybe 2 decades have consistently won the largest amount of World Bank contracts in Africa. That speaks to what Jude was saying about the competitiveness of the Chinese companies, the affordability and the quality of their work can meet the requirement of a lot of World Bank or African Development Bank financed projects. But I also heard from the companies during my field work that on the one hand, many of the companies think that this is what they are supposed to. Everyone who are competing in the African market should be able to win World Bank contracts because this just basic for them. And on the other hand, many of them seems to also become concerned about the geopolitical rivalry between China and the US, and they perceive that many like World Bank projects, there may be hostility towards Chinese companies there, and also many companies are still not very familiar with compliance requirements, and they ended up being sanctioned by the World Bank. So some of them are kind of taking a more cautious approach towards bidding for World Bank contracts because they fear that they might be sanctioned, or for political reasons, or they feel they're not prepared enough to bid for these contracts in terms of their legal requirements. I think there was a third question about the African countries' response to IICO. Of course, I think African countries should be welcome, but I mean, that's one of the reasons why the IICO becomes such a prospective model, because that's also demand from the host countries. They want investment rather than borrowing. They don't want to borrow more. They want just investment in terms of FDI, investment money coming into the infrastructure projects. So in that sense, that should be welcome. But the concern is whether there's enough capacity, institutional capacity in the African countries to carry out the PPP projects, because they really require a lot of input from the government too, in terms of, especially in like port projects, road projects, there's a lot of things that needs to be done by the government to make sure that these projects can be successful.
Thanks, Hong. Oscar, did you want to respond to any of the questions?
Yes, briefly. The concern on the extent to which Chinese companies are implementing World Bank social, is it social and environmental impacts, if I got the question right? I will see it this way, in the sense that Chinese actors generally, and of course, for the interest of the question at large, in the process of socialization within the international institution, and particularly the international environmental norms and practice, we have seen that taking shape gradually on certain issues. For example, corporate social responsibility, responding to a few issues in the local context, and such practices that are also advocated by World Bank, even though there's a bit of variations here and there. And so the degree to which I will say perhaps and anybody on this panel is free to help me on this, that it's gradually implementing certain aspect of World Bank required practice, of course, in recognition of different approach that are strictly followed by Chinese companies, and of course the requirements of the World Bank. I remember when the Chinese bank, rather when the Chinese firm, was it CRB? There's a Chinese firm that was blacklisted in the Philippines, and that brought some, lots of noise. And of course, there was need to have these companies to, implement this global practice. Yeah, so it's a gradual process of implementing. Thank you.
Jude.
Yeah, I would just add, so first, there is a convergence in standards when it comes to multilateral development banks. World Bank standards for projects are not that different from the African Development Bank, and not that different from the EU when the EU finances that. So because of that, so first there's the convergence of standards. Secondly, it's important to recognize that, well, this period of Chinese infrastructure building in Africa that we're talking about is more than 2 decades. So the Chinese have become really, really good at first understanding and complying with the World Bank standards, but more importantly, they've come to really understand the African market. So, during my time, some companies did get blacklisted, and every now and then you see it on you see the World Bank will publish companies that get blacklisted. But over time, the companies have simply gotten really better at that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, on most World Bank projects and African Development Bank projects, there are 2 groups that are hired by the client, the country. You hire the contractor who does the work, and you hire the owner's engineer, an engineering firm that supervises the work. For us, in most of our projects in Liberia, where the contractor was Chinese, the owner's engineer was usually European. It allowed us to be able to extract quality out of that. So we're not really engaging with the contractor as much as we are with the supervisor who's ensuring, because all of the payments have to be cleared by the owner's engineer. So by structuring the project in that way, we've been able to. The final thing I would say, I always tell this story about, we had a project with Czech, the China Harbor Engineering Company, and we agreed with Czech that we will hire a third party, an engineering firm from the UK, to supervise the work that they did. And so even in a place like Liberia, where the country is really small and the power asymmetry between us and the Chinese is significantly lopsided, by bringing in a third party who supervises the work on behalf of the client, you're able to get the best quality out of that. On the IICO, I feel like there's 2 things here. One is, first, it allows, it improves the space, because there's not that much money coming anymore in the government-to-government lending and sovereign lending. So you have the investment, but it also, I feel like it aggravates a problem that has always been there in Africa. And is the inability for local firms to grow, to become big enough to be able to do this work. So the more of that we see, where the Chinese firm is now in from concept to maintenance, it leaves very little space for local firms to grow and actually be able to do this. So I think in response for African governments, is something you have to take into account. You can't have for 30 years, 40 years, all of the infrastructure being built by external firms without growing the firms. And so I feel like there is a plus and minus to IICO.
Thank you, Jude. I know we're almost out of time. We typically end these at 2 o'clock, but we do have several more questions. So if our speakers are willing, I'll run through them, and you can select which ones you want to read, and we can try to give everyone a final 2 minutes. So Ian Borland asks to follow up on Dr. Moore's observation on asymmetries of power/interest vis-a-vis Chinese and African partners. Does the panel believe China has a long-term interest in genuinely displacing US/Europe and its norms, or is their engagement more opportunistic / short-term? Michael Kolakowski asks, what impact from Europe's global gateway do you expect on Chinese companies and involvement in the African infrastructure market? Tad Dadisman writes, the Chinese companies have several competitive advantages over other international companies in African projects. How significant to their competitiveness are factors such as cheap Chinese labor that these companies import to work into Africa to do their work, or the lack of Chinese government regulations governing their business practices overseas? And then finally, Richard America, I think this is more of a comment, but he writes that US multinational corporations can work with the US government, the African Development Bank, the UN, the AU, and the World Bank to accelerate overall progress and development in Africa. That will help reduce and solve the China problem, but Africa suffers from weak management in every sector. So can we strengthen African universities and especially their engineering and business schools? This would be key to preventing exploitative, predatory, neocolonial, imperialistic investment and trade behavior by China and Africa. Okay, that's it. Let me go through this one more time in the order that we presented, and if we can try to limit to one or two of those questions and a couple minutes each. Thanks. Hung.
Yeah, sure. I think let me first respond to the question about Chinese cheap labor. I think it has been always a contentious issue in China-Africa relations. I think in the earlier periods, cheap labor from China definitely was a very important part of the competitiveness of the Chinese companies, because they were actually at that time, earlier stage, they were acting as subcontractors of other international companies. But later on, when they moved to the EPC contractor, which has higher requirements for their engineering expertise and managerial expertise, the labor costs, the importance of labor costs actually, I think, declined. And by now, the Chinese labor costs has become high enough, the disparity between the labor costs in China and in Africa is so big that it's no longer a good strategy for Chinese companies to bring Chinese labor. Still, they are continuing to rely on the so-called skilled labor from China, usually in the few key positions in the whole team. But as long as they have a choice, they would want to hire local labor. That, of course, there's another set of issues regarding technology transfer, transfer of know-how. And that's another thing that I don't think the Chinese companies are doing a good job yet. But I just don't think labor is still a very important issue in terms of their cost advantage. And the global gateway, I think from Europe, from this time, my conversations with Chinese companies, some of them appear to be, they seemed to be quite excited when this global gateway idea was first proposed, and they were thinking that, oh, maybe they will be able to also look for financing from European financial institutions to help their market expansion in Africa. But later they realized that no, there's a lot of politics involved, and they probably wouldn't be able to get any part of the pie. So this is just an anecdotal, that's an anecdote regarding this question. But I think from the case of Lekki Port that I showed already, you're seeing that the Chinese companies need to work with other more established companies, especially from Europe in Africa, because in a lot of sense, still the European companies have a lot of advantage as early comers, and the Chinese companies have to work with them. So in that sense, they would love to work with other countries, in terms of financing and in terms of working in this kind of cooperation of the infrastructure projects. But just we'll see if the politics will allow it.
Thanks. Oscar.
Thanks once again. The concerns as to whether Chinese interests are likely to displace Western interest in Africa. Again, these concerns have been framed largely within the discussion on the implication of China in Africa. And it depends which way you see the engagement. Of course, those who subscribe to China threat narrative have always argued that China is long-sighted and it's heading to Africa to extract resources, to displace the traditional sphere of Western powers, to cleverly cooperate with authoritarian government in a sense that they can be able to manipulate governance practice, etc., etc. Those who subscribe to, moderate view see this as pure business. China in Africa are there purely to look for market, to look for opportunity to, extend surplus commodities back home. So depending the way you see, you visualize that perspective. Sometimes we in academics, we offer those perspectives, and we let those who are interested to follow the conversation to fit rather to sit where they think they can enjoy the story about China in Africa. I'll leave it at that point.
Thanks, Jude. You have the last word.
So I'll go really quickly. So on the labor question, not really, and in fact it's going to get even worse. Today the over 65 population in China is around 12.9%. By 2030, it's going to be around 30%. Taking people from China to take them elsewhere is going to be so expensive. It doesn't even make sense for Chinese companies to do that. And so, like Hung said, between 2000 and say 2006, 2007, yes. After 2008, no. Global Gateway has always, in my view, been a repackaging of commitments the Europeans have made before. There's no new money, nothing. No, sorry. It's not a competitor to BRI. Whether is this intent for the Chinese to displace the US and Europe, who cares? I mean, it's, Europe in Africa, US in Africa, China in Africa, they're all external actors in Africa. Why should Africa care about who's displacing whom? What's important here is whose presence in Africa is in the best interest of the continent. And I think if we as Africans, that's how we think about it, and we're doing great. But hey, thanks for having me again. It's a pleasure being here as always.
Laura, do you want to close us out?
Oh gosh, I thought you were going to, but I did pop my face back on. Well, thank you to most of all to the three speakers. I have learned so much today. I am sure that those of us who stayed to the end have. And that's why I want to thank all three of you for such thoughtful presentations and wish you the best on your continuing research. We'll continue to look to you to provide us with this important context information and the view from both the continent and from China as well as these things develop. And thank you, Dr. Park, again for organizing us, and to all of you who stayed on the call. Please continue to look out for our ongoing events in spring. We'll be back with another round of Friday speaker series related to similar and intersecting themes. So wishing you all the best and look forward to being together again soon. Take care. Bye.